Most people grow up believing in some simple logic. If it's legal, then it must be right. And if it's illegal, then it must be wrong. But history, philosophy, and conscience tells a better story, or at least a different one. So today I want to ask some fundamental questions. When is obedience moral? When is disobedience moral? And why government is not the source of morality? And what happens to societies when they forget these truths? And before we can answer those questions, we have to talk about what's right and wrong and whether that's objective and subjective. And what is the basis for morality? The first precept we have to agree on is that morality and rights do not exist from a government. If morality comes from government, then anything the government decides to do is automatically objectively righteous. But if morality exists before government, then anything the government does must be judged against that morality. And this raises a question of human ethics. Do governments create your rights, or do governments exist to protect the rights that you already possess? Ezra Taft Benson explained this perfectly in his paper, The Proper Role of Government. Government does not grant rights. Government does not manufacture freedom. The two truths about rights is that they exist before government and they are independent of government. You do not have a right to life because Parliament says it does. You have a right to life because you already possess it. It is yours. You have a right to liberty not because a judge put a stamp of approval on it, but because that exists before a judge even says you had the right to begin with. You have a right to property, and you are your own property. And the extensions of you are your time, effort, and labor, which are also yours. Government is not your conscience, it is not your parent, and it is certainly not your God. At best, government is a hired bodyguard to protect the rights that already exist. And if your bodyguard protects you, it is legitimate. And if your bodyguard harms you, it is criminal. This same moral standard applies to the state. So when modern leaders proudly proclaim that we should be giving up our rugged individualism for the soft warmth of collectivism, it may sound compassionate, but collectivism always requires power. It requires someone, somewhere, to decide what freedoms can be created or granted, and in contrast, what freedoms can be taken. It also decides what property can be granted or taken, what voices should be amplified or silenced, all under the auspices of the greater good. Now, in contrast to collectivism, natural rights say quite the opposite. The individual is morally real, and the state is morally a derivative. That truth must anchor everything. Now, let's set the tone for the framework of the law. Imagine a grid with 4 boxes. Across the bottom, it says from good law to bad law. And on the top, it says bad to disobey, good to disobey. This gives us 4 moral realities. In quadrant A, we have a good law, but it's also good to disobey. Now, this points to the idea of a higher moral duty. And that's because even good laws can't replace or overcome conscience. Speed limits exist for safety reasons, but if you are rushing somebody to the hospital, does breaking the speed limit seem justified? If you're not putting anybody else in immediate danger and trying to preserve the life that you're carrying to the hospital, does breaking the speed limit make sense? Or would you just go at the speed limit to drive that person to who may be bleeding out in your car? So when a good law collides with a higher obligation, conscience outranks compliance. In quadrant B, we have bad laws, good to disobey. I would call this quadrant civil courage and moral disobedience. Some laws are unjust. Some laws are immoral. Some laws demand compliance by being wrong. And in these moments, obedience is not a virtue. Obedience rather becomes participation. History proves this again and again. Laws such as apartheid, segregation laws, laws prohibiting and silencing personal speech and conscience. Its authority claimed with legality, but the side of history always sides with those who stood up against injustice. Henry David Thoreau asked this question bluntly. unjust laws exist. Shall we be content to obey them? Shall we endeavor to amend them and obey them until we have succeeded? Or shall we transgress them at once? He wasn't celebrating chaos. He was warning that obedience can become moral failure. Decades later, Martin Luther King carried that truth forward. One has not only a legal but moral responsibility to obey just laws. Conversely, one has a moral responsibility to disobey unjust laws. Not just permission, but rather responsibility. When the law demands injustice, disobedience becomes courage, and obedience to bad laws becomes complicity. Here's a sobering lesson from history to illustrate the point. If anyone doubts that obedience become evil, all we have to do is turn back the pages of the history and take a look. In World War II, 1930s Germany didn't start with death camps. It began with laws. It began with paperwork. It began with obedience. It began with good citizens following orders. People in society were encouraged and expected to report Jewish families, to enforce identity restrictions, and to accept confiscations, all in part to help the state to do what was lawful. Millions of people didn't think they were monsters. They thought they were following the rules. They thought they were responsible, obedient. But the legality of their actions didn't make it moral. It made the law an accomplice to evil, and obedience an instrument of cruelty. That is just one example out of thousands I could have chosen to demonstrate what happens when society forgets that morality pre-exists the government, and when the law departs from justice and citizens feel that their conscience is silenced. Evil doesn't just happen. The law becomes stamped, approved, filed, and organized, and legally administered and carried out. Now, the Milgram experiment was designed to understand how philosophically normal people were capable of carrying out bad things. The findings of these experiments in the 1960s were shocking. We were just following orders. We were just told what we were supposed to do. What the Milgram experiment proved was how the common person was easily manipulated by somebody in a position of authority. In fact, it empirically proved that people were willing to cause harm and even commit murder because somebody told them to do it. It also discovered that the vast majority of people do not see the law as being violent, and they will support authoritarian rule if they are told to do so. Now, here in Canada, our legal framework recognizes that governments can pass bad laws. Now, in order to help stop bad governance, that's why the Canadian system is designed with the Charter, the Supreme Court, and constitutional limits on power. In the Supreme Court example, they exist to measure the laws against deeper principles. And sometimes they will strike them down or make suggestions to modify them or demand or require changes to them. Now, while that's good, it's not perfect. The Supreme Court can make bad decisions because they are human. It's not infallible. And governments can override rights using the notwithstanding clause, meaning that even in a democracy in Canada, and even with the Supreme Court to back it up, we should never rely on outsourcing anything, especially morality, to institutions. Because conscience still matters, judgment still matters, and courage still matters. Now let's return to our graph and look at good laws and that are bad to disobey. I would call this quadrant functional justice. And these are laws that align with generally accepted moral truth. Murder is wrong. Theft is wrong. Fraud is wrong. And not because government declared them to be wrong, but because they are wrong. In these cases, law just simply recognizes reality. And when the law aligns with life, liberty, and dignity, obeying the law aligns with moral good. Now, if every law was like this, life would be a lot simpler, but it isn't. Our final quadrant is bad laws and bad to disobey. I call this quadrant the wrong response to the wrong laws. And to be honest, when I was thinking about this video, this was the one that I was struggling with the most. But we had to flush it out logically to come to the conclusion that this does exist. This quadrant recognizes that some laws are flawed, but it still remains selfish or destructive to disobey them. For example, a clumsy environmental law may need reform, but dumping toxic materials in somebody's fresh water system is still immoral. A flawed tax system may exist, but evading or cheating the tax system for selfish reasons is still bad. An unjust law does not automatically make the lawbreaker righteous. And why is that? Because character still matters. So what does this all tell us? Law and government is not the source of morality. Governments don't create right and wrong. Authority does not magically transform injustice into righteousness. Legality does not equal morality. Morality comes first. Rights come first. The human individual comes first. Government, when it is legitimate, protects those things. And when it doesn't protect those things, it's not the individual standing guilty before the law. It is the law standing guilty before morality. And let's be honest, history has never credited the law with rescuing humanity from injustice. It has always come down to people, individuals rescuing humanity from injustice. People with a conscience, people with courage, people unwilling to mix and confuse legality with morality. So the most dangerous question we have to ask ourselves is not, is it legal? We have to ask ourselves, is it moral? Because sometimes obeying the law is right, and sometimes disobeying the law is right also. Sometimes breaking the law is evil, and sometimes obeying the law is evil. The most dangerous society is never the one with the most powerful government. It is the one where the people stop morally thinking about it. If this video challenged you as much as it challenged me in making it, make sure you like, subscribe, and hit that notification bell for upcoming videos. And let's continue to build a culture that understands the difference between the law and justice.